Hello, welcome back to my channel. This is Lily Loves Learning, and today we are going to walk through core knowledge. So core knowledge is a free program, free curriculum that you can use. It was designed for public school, but they have opened it up so that everyone can use that information that's available. And you go to the website coreknowledge.org, as you see here, and then there is a button that you can go to that's highlighted for you, download free curriculum. So if you click on that, it will take you to a page, and then you can start looking for the free curriculum that you want to download. It is broken up by grade level. So right now I have it filtered for grade 4, but as you can see, it has grades 1 through 8. Preschool and kindergarten, and then higher level, they have some for high school. So you can use this for a number of grades. You can also use it just for one topic, all of your topics, because they now have all of your core topics covered. They have language arts, history and geography, science, and mathematics, which is the newest one. So I'm going to walk through each of the core sections separately, and you can see the difference. Even though some of the topics may be similar, the information that they are teaching and the way that they are teaching it will be different. The first will be language arts. For grades 1 through 3, they have separate sections for their listening and learning, which would be more of the standard language arts, reading, comprehension, vocabulary sections. And then they have a separate one for skills. And the skills would be more for spelling, skills within language arts. However, once you move to 4th grade, they combine those two, and so you would just have one combined section for both the skills and the listening and learning. So I'm going to filter by language arts, and then we will walk through what they have available to you. So for grade 4, you can see this is a CKLA, so Core Knowledge Language Arts unit. They categorize them in kind of the 3 main areas. One would be for a specific literature unit on a given book. And then they also have a language arts section for both history topics. So for instance, they have the Middle Ages, American Revolution, and then they also have them for science. So in the grade 4, they have geology. It looks like that's it. And so there may be similar topics under the history and science sections for those same things, but the information and the knowledge that is being taught will be different depending on if it's the language arts or the history and science. So I will show you now inside of one of the units for the language arts. So I chose to pull the Middle Ages. This is Unit 2, and the information that is available to download, you can download them separately, or you can download all of the information. The main items that you will need to use will be the teacher's guide, the reader for the student, and the activity book. So this will be the activities that will go along with each of the lessons that you're teaching. I also wanted to bring up that they have now a digital component that you can use. So if you wanted to use this to teach, present, they have them for different lessons. And so you can see here's a map of Europe that you might be sharing on your screen. And then the next slide will be the answers to those. And it has these following each of those lessons. So in the very beginning section, you will see which one of the items go to each of the lessons. For right now, I am going to walk you through the teacher guide. This can be the one that oftentimes can overwhelm people when they first start with CKLA, there is a lot of information in the teacher's guide. It is meant for a classroom, so it provides a lot of activities, guidance for teaching in a classroom, and it provides all the amounts of time that's required for each of the sections. So I'm going to try to walk you through at least the upfront section and then one of the lessons. So this one is for the Middle Ages, and it will specify that this is a teacher's guide. A few pages down will then give you the contents. It provides it broken up by lesson. They are color-coded to tell you if it's a reading, a skill, or a writing section for that specific lesson. Sometimes it'll include all of them. Sometimes it'll include, one or two of those. So you can see this gives you a nice overview of what all of the lessons will look like for just this Middle Ages unit. And then there are also some resources in the back for additional information. Further down, we'll give you an introduction to the whole unit. So this is all of the Unit 2 Middle Ages. It will give you a nice overview introduction of what is going to be covered. So it talks about what's important, what are some of the core objectives that were in previous grades that the students might need to know or may have covered if you did prior units in CKLA. Then they'll go through an overview of those lessons, now with some time blocks in there. So this can help you schedule those different time blocks. You can use some of these or you can use all of them. And then if you are a homeschooling student, these sections may not take as long because some of them have discussion questions within the classroom. And if there's just one or two students, it may not take as long to cover those discussions. You can also choose not to if you don't need any of the skills or you're using a different writing unit. You can just eliminate that from that specific lesson and just focus on the other key areas that are discussed. Then you will get an overview of the reader. So that was that second key item that you will need that have the stories in them. So that'll give you an overview of what is included in the reader, what you're looking to do in the writing sections, and then these are the different skills that they're going to be covering in this unit. So grammar, spelling, morphology. Some of the units also include these assessments that you can use, but you're not required to do the assessments. Then it moves into the lessons themselves. So you have an introduction at the top for the whole unit, and then you'll be broken up by each of the lessons. So if you are looking to just kind of narrow down your focus, you can just move directly to that lesson and look through what's included in that when you're trying to prepare for your lesson. Gives you the core content objectives, also breaks down this lesson. So it'll give you the time, what's covered in that time slot, and then the materials that you can use to support that. It'll give you primary focus of the lessons, and then there's also some vocabulary. So there is vocabulary that will be a part of the readers. So there is usually, I think they underline the word when you're in the actual story, and then there's a brief definition of each of those words. For some of the advanced preparation, this will help you if you are looking to add some additional content to the lesson. For instance, this is, even though it's not a history unit, it's language arts, it is covering a topic on history. So there is some timeline cards that can be used so you can see when in time this is currently being identified to have that available to your student. And then if you have any other charts or high-level questions, or maybe some of those digital items available to you, you might want to look at and prep ahead of time. Then there is going to be reviewing prior knowledge. So like I mentioned, sometimes there's other CKLA or history guides that were covered in prior grade levels. These are often a summary of what we should know or what may help us to have as background information prior to this new unit. So this one also includes labeling a map. So then in here, it will tell you when you move to an activity page. So it'll tell you activity page 1.1. So if I were to move over now to that activity book, I could scroll down. So that first one tells me that this is lesson 1, and then the second one is that activity 1. So here is that map that we saw in the digital content. Here it is in paper. So the students can label this for that specific item. Then there's talk of creating a timeline. And again, what I usually do is review this ahead of time, and then I cross out anything that I don't think I need to cover. And just to make a note of, because there's a lot of information in here, some of this you may not need to cover, or maybe you can cover it in a much shorter time frame than what they're specifying here. So that's that beginning portion. So this is like the intro. Then you move into reading for this specific lesson. So in this lesson, we're reading chapter 1. This will be a read aloud. But for your students, they can follow along in the reader. So this will be the same unit, Unit 2, Middle Ages, Knights, Castles, and Chivalry. And then it will specify that it is the reader. So if I scroll down, you can see it has all of those chapters. So for us, we are doing chapter 1, Welcome to the Middle Ages. So we would have the students follow along as we are reading this one out loud. So there's an introduction to the overall reader. This is the first chapter. So this is just kind of an intro to the overall reader. And then we have an intro to the chapter. You will probably be reviewing. So for instance, this looks like vocabulary. There is an activity page 1.2. So if I move over to that, you'll see that it has those same vocabulary words. So this the student can look at in front of them and review before we start that chapter, just so that we have a definition of what those words are that we're going to see in that reader. And then you'll see farther down that says, while you read this chapter, students will complete activity page 1.3 by identifying events that led to the Middle Ages. So we have now gone through the first 3 activity pages, and we haven't started yet. So we haven't done the reader yet, so we want to get this out for the students, let them know that, hey, we're going to be listening to important events. Let's jot those down, and then we can note which page in the reader that you found that information. And then you start the read aloud. So you could read this aloud to your student. You can have them read one page, you read another, however you want to use this. So there are information on the reader in here. And then at the end of the chapter, you wrap up by asking questions of the students. So as you saw in the prior pages, there are questions that are being asked, and then you can see on the teacher guide where the answers to those questions would be housed. Usually for us, we don't necessarily ask all the questions, but we do try to ask different levels of questions so that we cover both just a literal answer as well as thinking farther along and looking at some of these either evaluative or inferential questions, just to do that next step. They also go into more detail on specific words. You can do this, you can give definitions, or you can work through these word works on a specific vocabulary word. And then lastly, they have a take-home material. So again, these are used for public school. So these would have both stuff you would learn in the classroom as well as things you would take home for homework to do. So you can either decide to do these with your student, or if you don't think that additional information is required, you can skip those. But if we went farther down into that 1.4 activity, there were some pages, and then the students would answer questions and note where the answers to those were on which page. So there could be some comprehension activities for that one. And then it says for activity 1.5, you're going to be using that as a reference throughout the unit. So this gives you a glossary of terms that the students can use throughout the entire lesson. And that is the end of lesson 1. And it is very similar through all of the lessons, and you can see in this one now we have writing. So we don't just have the reading, the skills, we have added in writing. So they vary throughout each lesson what elements of the language arts curriculum will be covered in those lessons. So that covers the CKLA, so the language arts for grade 4. And again, you have the teacher's guide, which gives you a lot of information, and the reader for the student, and then those activity guides to work through for each of the lessons. And then a supplemental item that they've added are these digital components that you may decide you want to use if you're sharing something on a screen or want to put up like a poster for the classroom. Okay, so next we are going to move on to history. Okay, so to look for history, I'm going to go back here and change my filters to look at the history and geography units. So these ones will be named CKHG for history and geography, and these will cover different history and geography units, but may include some similar topics as to what you are doing in CKLA. So they have medieval Europe and medieval Islamic empires, early and medieval African kingdoms. So we did those Middle Ages. This will cover some of the history topics in the Middle Ages as well. Let's take a look at some of our history units. So the two main items you'll need is the teacher guide and the student reader. So the teacher guide for the history and geography will also be broken up by the chapters in the reader. So if you follow along in the reader, you can see that it has all of those chapters. So the teacher guide will follow along in the same chapter order. Just like for the language arts program, the history and geography will also include a high-level introduction about this specific unit. So the big idea, what those students should have already learned from prior core knowledge units, and then what they need to learn for these units. And then they give a little timeline over here on the side as well. Then they'll be at a glance. So these are the important ideas that the students should be learning in this particular unit. And then also what the teachers need to know. So this may be helpful reference information for the teacher to have in preparation for this specific unit. So you can review that prior to starting. Then it'll tell you what's required for the students. So we mentioned that student reader. And then the teacher components. So this specific teacher guide. And then they also have some image cards that you can use if you want to show something larger than what's shown on the teacher guide for those images. Then there's going to be timelines. If you are using that timeline space on a wall, these would be the time periods that would need to be written for that particular unit. Here's also some image cards that can be used to be posted on that timeline. It will give you the timeline for the medieval Europe unit, understanding those references. Then it'll move on to the pacing guide, how we're going to be doing the read aloud for that reader. And then those big questions that are going to be covered in each of those different chapters of the book. Similarly to CKLA, they have a core vocabulary for each of those chapters. And then you can see the activity pages that are going to be used for each of those chapters. There's an additional activities section as well. So those are found at the end of each chapter in the teacher guide. And it mentions while there are many suggested activities, you should choose just only 1 or 2 per chapter based on what you think the students might need or their interests. And again, with homeschooling, you have the flexibility to do all of them, none of them, whatever you think works best for you and your student. They have a sample pacing guide for each of the weeks. This is showing a 5-day week. So if you don't do 5 days per week, then you could just follow along in the day number. And this is the estimate for how long this will take to get through this specific unit. They also show for medieval Europe, for CKLA, when those different sections would be covered similarly to this unit. So it shows on day 12 for medieval Europe is when that Welcome to the Middle Ages, which was that first chapter, would be covered. Has space for your own if you want to write your own pacing guide. And then you start on each chapter. So each chapter will also have that big question listed again that was in the introduction. It will have the primary objectives that you're trying to cover in this chapter, any of that background information that you might need, and then the materials for this specific chapter. And I like this. It summarizes all of the activity pages that you'll be covering in this unit. It provides the core vocabulary that will be in the student reader for this chapter. And then it also gives you now the core lesson. So again, they give you time. Here's the overall time that might be required. And then for each section, what they estimate that section should take in that amount of time. So you introduce that student reader just like you introduced the CKLA one. Then you have this changing times. So for this first chapter, Changing Times, there'll be an intro to that specific chapter, and then you get into the reading. So I think for this one, it was saying for the students to read these. So again, you can either read it aloud, you can have the student read it all, or there could be some combination of both. And then once you're done reading that section, you will have those questions again, similarly to CKLA. But the questions will be more geared towards the history side of it. So there'll be those literal questions, and then you may want to pick 1 or 2 of those more advanced questions for your student to ask and answer. And then looks like there are some additional pages with more questions related to that specific section. So you can determine how many questions you want to cover in each of those pages for that specific chapter. Then you get to, if there's timeline cards, you can add those to your timeline and then check for understanding of that big question that was brought up at the beginning of the chapter. There's these additional activities that are available as well, but as mentioned in the beginning, you may want to pick just one or two of these per chapter to make it so it's not overwhelming for your student. And then that covers your first chapter. So it breaks up the chapter a little bit more than like in the CKLA one, where there are different sections of the chapter that give you maybe some more background, more questions, diving farther in for you to do with your students. And maybe that could be based on what their interests are, or maybe areas that you haven't covered elsewhere in your learning. And that is the history units. And now we move on to science. So for science, if you want to check out those units, you can come back over here, get rid of the filter here, move it over to science, and then we can see the units that are covered for science for grade 4. So those are the 8 units that are covered for grade 4. And some of these things may have similar topics in prior units, but they expand upon them as you get farther along in each grade level. So for the science units, they're going to look very similar to the history and geography. They will have a teacher guide and a reader as the main components. In the teacher guide, if you come down to the table of contents, we can look at the reader. It'll show these chapters for that specific reader. And then you can see those in each of these sections following along as well. It will be broken up very similarly to the other types of units, where there is an introduction to the overall unit. So here's the big idea for this specific unit. Gives you a section on what the student should already know from prior units, and then what grade level those were taught in. And then what the students need to learn in this specific unit. It introduces the student reader that has the same topic. And then it has the teacher guide. So it gives you an explanation of what is included in the teacher guide. There's a high level, and this one is broken up into 3 parts. But through all of those chapters, what's that big question that we want to try to ask and get our students to be able to answer? So that's summarized. This one has a unit review and assessment. And then all of the activity pages that will be used for each of the lessons. If there are online resources for science, there's a link for that. And then this one gives you some teaching strategies for how to cover this unit. This is nice, especially for science, but this gives you an overview of the materials and equipment that are needed for each of the lessons, so you can have those prepped ahead of time and not have to go searching for them when you're in the middle of the unit. This one also has a sample pacing guide, so you can use this as you need, and then depending on how many days a week you are studying this unit, will determine how many days this one will, or how many weeks this will take. They also give you the option to write your own. So let's say you space it out every 3 days. Well, then you can have that available to you to use and insert into your own planner. And since this one's broken into different parts, this one gives you an overview of what the first part is going to cover. So there are 6 lessons in this one. It covers that big question again, and then has kind of the high level what's required in advance for each of those. So here's what's in each of those lessons. And then you get to that first lesson. Similarly to the history and geography, you have the big question at the very top, so that's repeated again. Oftentimes you can come just directly to these lesson units. If you like that schedule to see high level, how many days is this going to take, you can pull from that. But the real meat of it is all included in that specific lesson. What's the vocabulary that's needed and covered in this unit? Those instructional resources and that material list is again included here. So you don't necessarily need that upfront stuff. If that's too much information, you can move directly into here. Then it breaks it down time again. Here's what they estimate the total time for this lesson. And then for each section, how much time that one's going to take. So this one is focusing on that big question right off the bat, previewing those core vocabulary words that are going to be covered in the reader and the lesson. This one has a virtual tour, so it tells you on the side that this is going to require those online resources. So it gives you the link there. This will define a problem. And then here's some additional information on the science of it. So background information for the student. Then there is student research. So it shows you that activity page is going to be used. And then compare design solutions. And then there's an opportunity to check for understanding of that particular area. So these are pretty similar to those history and geography units. This one looks like it also includes some writing in this section. And then that is pretty much the science units. And lastly, the new area on the block is the mathematics. So for math in grade 4, there are 9 units. And I pulled one from grade 3 just to check out. So let's take a look at the math unit. The math unit will also have a teacher's guide and a student workbook. So for the teacher guide, this will have that intro and then the lessons associated with this specific unit. And then since this is math, this one will work a little differently. You won't have a reader, but this will be the problems that you're going to solve. And it does use some visuals to help the student visually understand what each of these numbers represent. So in the teacher guide, you will see at a glance for each of those sections, what is that high-level math topic that you're going to cover? So if you don't use this for all of your math, this gives you an opportunity if there is a specific subject that you need a little bit more support on, you could go directly to that unit and that section and just cover that one. So it could be used as a supplemental item as well. So it gives you the learning goals. So that's kind of like that big question that you had in some of those other units. These are the learning goals that we are looking for our student. And that covers what each of those are for the different sections within the math program. Then it'll give you what types of materials might be needed for that lesson. So for A, B, C, and D, and then each lesson within that section. These give you centers, but oftentimes you do this with classrooms. So we don't usually use any of these. Okay, and then we start on the lessons. It gives you the standards alignment, the teacher goal, as well as the student learning goal, the purpose of this lesson, and then gives you some additional options for students that may need a different activity type. The materials that would be required, and then another lesson timeline. So this gives you overall, these are the expected amount of times to cover this lesson. So they have a warm-up. They have that activity 1. Those additional things that you might need depending on the types of learners that you have. That activity 2. And then the end of the lesson. And then that would follow along with the student pages that are given in those lessons. So that's lesson 1 and that activity 2. And that covers all of the different subjects that are in core knowledge. And as I mentioned before, this is a free curriculum. So it's very nice to look through here, see what topics are there. You don't have to cover all of them. Maybe you're just looking for one on a reader or maybe a history topic, and then you can just cover that. So thank you. Appreciate it. Please hit that thumbs up, like, subscribe, and we will talk to you later. Bye.